Tom Cruise is a legendary communicator and a master of frame control. So I'd like to point out some of the verbal framing techniques that he uses to maintain dominance in his interviews and interactions.
Me talking to you today that I had to embark on a 4-hour crash course in Scientology and what it's all about. Why then was it a condition of me talking to you today that I had to spend quite an intense 4.5 hours in the Church of Scientology here in Los Angeles?
Oh, you didn't have to. You could have said no.
I felt I had to.
Okay, well, that's how you felt. People are interested.
So here you'll see a theme of Tom pushing him towards taking personal responsibility. This is a very important thing for Tom. This is one of his values that you'll see is personal responsibility and taking account, being accountable to your words. So it's important to take notice of that, because if you learn to spot other people's values, you can communicate with them a little bit better. You can be more persuasive and speak a language that they will hear. So if you hear someone pushing a value constantly throughout an interaction, like they value strength, or they value freedom, or they value connection, it's good to train yourself to notice what the other person is looking to get out of the interaction. And here, Tom is challenging the interviewer to personal responsibility. He also answers the question asked in a very broad, general sort of way, and I'll get back to why that's important in a little bit.
In Scientology, and I find that people wanted to know. They want to know about it. And it's also, there's people out there that want help and that need help.
Would you also agree, though, Tom, that there's a perception out there that it gets bad press, cult-like secrecy, controlling, and you almost have to defend it?
I don't feel it's ignorance breeds bigotry.
Right.
Breeds racism. Okay. You have been there and you've seen it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So ignorance breeds bigotry, breeds racism. These words they could be word salad, and we don't really know what he means when he uses those particular words. They have a personal meaning, and when you blend a bunch of those, what we would refer to as nominalizations, so a complex process that's been reduced into a noun, simplified, we don't really understand the meaning that he's drawing from. So when a politician strings together a bunch of words like freedom, safety, America, we don't really know, because those words are pretty ambiguous. And especially if you hear someone use those types of words or strings together a bunch of word salad in response to a very specific question about a specific topic, then it could be pointing to somebody purposely using ambiguous language to avoid a specific topic. So that's something to pay attention to. Sometimes this is an aspect of someone's natural communication style, and sometimes it's being used more strategically to evade questioning. But either way, it's very valuable to be able to notice when that happens and when somebody has avoided your very specific question with a very broad answer.
Okay.
Do you feel discriminated against when people say this is what Scientology is, that you're a bunch on a lunatic fringe or whatever? Does that...
Peter?
Tom?
No one's ever said that to me.
But no, I mean that perception out there.
Yeah, but that's not the perception out there.
So when addressed about this broad idea of public perception, Tom responds by very much narrowing his focus on the interviewer, and again challenging him to be accountable for the question he asked and saying, that specific thing has never been said to me. So again, we're talking about the broader perception of Scientology, so we're going from broad to specific. So Tom's able to jump from specific concepts to broad concepts, from personal responsibility to diffusing his responsibility onto groups of people, talking about people in general. So what's very interesting here is most people don't see those lines of communication opening up in that way. And so they walk away from an interaction having no clue what just happened. They just completely got destroyed in an interaction, or they spoke past the other person. They got nowhere with the other person, and they couldn't understand why. And it's because when somebody jumps topics, a lot of times people don't see it, or when somebody jumps to a more general or vague terminology, we don't notice it as it's happening. They've gone from specific to general, from general to specific, and this thing kind of happens under the radar. So this is how Tom is effortlessly controlling the conversation, because he's able to switch what we would call to the level of abstraction, which is how general or how specific a conversation is. So if we're talking about wealth, we could be talking about a more specific type of wealth, like livestock. And if we're talking about livestock, which type of livestock? Well, we could be talking about cows. Well, which type of cow, or which cow specifically? Well, the cow is named Betsy, right? So Betsy the cow. We've jumped down in specificity, right? So that's all it means when you talk about levels of abstraction. And so when we're talking about a big, broader level concept like bigotry breeds racism, breeds, these things are broad level concepts, so it's a little hard to pinpoint the meaning. So when something's very broad like that, it's a little bit harder to, I guess, attack a concept like that. It's a little more amorphous than something specific. So here Tom is just jumping back and forth, and I'd like to give you a very important principle of frame control, which is to always remember that the one who controls the level of abstraction during a conversation will control the frame of that conversation. So control the level of abstraction, control the frame, because you're controlling what is being focused on in the conversation. More on that in future videos.
That is absolutely, maybe from your perspective.
This isn't my personal opinion. I'm just saying, how do you feel about that when people...
Well, how would you feel?
Oh, if it was my faith, I'd feel
Well, not
really...
not even your own faith. I find that appalling when people who don't know what they're talking about say things like that. I think it's appalling. I think it's appalling that they're still burning synagogues in France. I think it's appalling how certain Muslims are being treated. I think it's absolutely appalling when we talk about freedom of speech and human rights. I think it's appalling that they electric shock people. I think it's appalling that they drug children. I think it's appalling that they say that there are no solutions for those things. I think it's appalling that people have to live a life of drug addiction, okay, when I have personally helped people get off drugs.
Okay, so here what he said, again, he took this specific criticism of Scientology and he jumped to these more broader level criticisms of, or more broader level types of persecution within the world and religion. And I'm not sure exactly which each of those meant, because again, he's talking very broad on these topics. And then, also a little side note too, when he says drugging children, it's important to be keyed into that type of languaging, because when somebody says drugging children, that's a very emotionally charged way to phrase that. Now, he would argue very, very, you've seen him in other interviews, argue that yes, children are being drugged, and we're not, he wouldn't word it in a more defensible way. He wouldn't say, well, this is children being over-medicated, or he wouldn't say, well, children are being prescribed things that they probably don't need by medical professionals. He doesn't refer to it as that. I just wanted to point that out as an aside, because when you get somebody who's talking about broader level principles, or they're using very emotionally charged language, you can bring them back to the specific. You can ask them what their definition of something is, or you can get them to refocus on the topic. Like, I'm not sure what that has to do with this question, and then you can restate your question. So there's other ways to challenge them back to specificity that can be very powerful as well.
It's obvious Tom Cruise is a passionate man, especially passionate when it comes to his own family. He's determined his adopted kids, Isabella and Connor, will have as normal an upbringing as possible.
Your family life was difficult. You're estranged from your father, and your mum and dad were divorced. Has that had an impact on you as a dad, how you bring up your children?
Do you have children?
I'm hoping to.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I hope I can.
So he asks, do you have children? And then he shifts in his chair. Could have been uncomfortable about the asking of a question like that and going into the personal realm. We don't know, just from something as simple as shifting in a chair. But he does ask the interviewer again, do you have children? So quite a few times there's this sort of social, I don't know, this social contract going on, or this social, I guess the word would be custom, that when somebody is doing an interview, it's not really polite to turn the interview back on the interviewer, right? Sometimes it can be done charismatically, but there's this idea that the interviewer is just supposed to be invisible, asking questions on behalf of the people very dispassionately, but trying to get to the truth. And what Tom is doing here is really making it clear to the interviewer that he can get personal very quickly, right? He can, if it seems like when he's asked a personal question, he's firing back with asking personal questions to the other person. He's sort of mirroring his communication. Very interesting to pay attention to it.
Good, good. Yeah, absolutely. You know, absolutely. I've got a great mother, and very close family, and it's something that I always wanted to be a father. You know, and I think that one of the great things that we've done with our children is allowing them to be themselves.
Is that hard, to give them a perspective that they are like the kids down the road, even though their parents are who you are?
Here's the point. Everybody's different, Peter. I don't buy into this whole thing of being normal. There's no such thing as normal. When you really look at someone's life and you look into their life, everyone has a story.
Yeah.
Everyone has something that is going on.
So here he's asked, is it hard to give them a perspective that they're like normal children? And so it's a very specific question to Tom. And Tom, again, appeals to these broader level principles. So he's talking at a much higher level of abstraction than the interviewer is asking questions on. So he talks about the differences in people, and then he offers a kind of deconstruction of this concept of normal. I don't really believe in normal. And then he goes on,
that is very unique to them. So that, with regards to our children, it's, I think they feel very fortunate for the life they have, and they're really good people. I'm really proud of them.
So then he says, well, they're fortunate he thinks they feel fortunate for the life they have. They're good people, and he's proud of them. But none of that really refers back to the original question, which he doesn't have to. And that's another strategy I'd like to point out as well, is that you don't have to answer questions directly as they're asked. Sometimes questions are framed in a negative way, or sometimes questions are delivered a little bit too personally, and sometimes a strategy to use is to answer a question as if they had asked the question you wanted them to ask, or as if they had focused on the thing you wanted them to focus on. So just pointing it out that he didn't really answer the question, but then again, you don't necessarily have to.
Of course, the crew's children are Australian citizens and spend much of their time here with their mother, Nicole Kidman. But it was when our conversation turned to Nicole that the cool man of Hollywood turned icy.
So a quick note when he says when our conversation turned to Nicole, which is very interesting because he's using the passive voice. So the passive voice refers to things as if they just kind of happened, right? So, there was an invasion of this other country, when in reality we invaded the other country, would be an example. So it's stating something in a way that takes the image out of the person's mind, the listener's mind, about what actually happened. It's a more vague way to refer to it, because the truth is he turned the conversation on to Nicole. The interviewer turned the conversation to Nicole. It didn't just happen that way. So, if Tom could hear that, he would have definitely called out the lack of agency that the interviewer had when referring to it in the passive voice.
Now, Nicole, when you were married, it was like you were an adopted part of Australia. Do you still have a connection to Australia?
Yeah, of course, my children are Australian. Absolutely. I have a lot of friends in Australia. I love Australia.
Was Nicole the love of your life?
What do you mean, Peter?
You were married for 10 years.
Listen, we raised children. I mean, how do you answer that? How do you answer that question? She's someone that I plan on getting married again.
You do?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And having kids?
Absolutely.
But Nicole was a major part of your life and a love of your life at the time.
I loved Nick very much. There's no question.
Would you like Nicole to remarry?
Yes. I want Nicole to be happy. That's what I want.
And do you have a relationship where you talk, it's a parenting relationship, and talk professionally about each other's
Why
work?
don't we, listen, here's the thing, Peter.
Yeah.
You're stepping over a line now. You're stepping over a line. You know you are.
I suppose they're questions, though,
Peter.
that people want to know.
Peter, you want to know. Take
And-
responsibility for what you want to know. Don't say what other people. This is a conversation that I'm having with you right now.
You're right.
Okay. So I'm just telling you right now. Okay? Just put your manners back in.
Do you think I was out of line?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I apologise for that
Good.
sincerely.
Good.
I admired.
So I like the way that he calls out Peter. It was polite, it was confident, and it was direct. This is a very overt way to bring awareness to someone when they overstep a boundary. And it takes a lot of confidence, takes a lot of practice. You know, he attempts, the interviewer, Peter, attempts to defend his overstep by saying these are questions that people want to know. So diffusing responsibility by pointing to other people who might want to know these things, and also pointing a bit to his role as an interviewer. But Tom wasn't having it. He shut him down immediately. And again, Tom focuses on Peter's personal responsibility and agency in asking the question and pointing out his intention.
her, and I thought that I wanted to meet her.
Yet
So-
seldom.
And there is a line that you have to draw. 20 years' time, where...
People want to know about my life.
Yeah. But when I...
And has manners and things that I say, you know what? I wouldn't answer that to someone coming up to me at a party.
Yeah, yeah.
I have no problem. Of course I know people want to know about my life.
Yeah. But when I read so much about you, Tom, these are questions you answer.
Peter, you want to waste your time on this right
Oh,
now?
I don't.
Or do you want to ask some other questions?
20 years' time, where will Tom
Peter,
Cruise...
good.
Look at how quickly he jumps topics when Tom calls about. You know, Tom really applied the pressure there to him. So it's a powerful way to frame this question. So sometimes you can word something as an either or proposition. You're either wasting your time, Peter, or we're moving on, right? So one of the ideas is made to sound like garbage, and the other option is to sound great by comparison. Of course, if somebody says this to you, you can always feel free to present, additional options if those options are there. But just know rhetorically, this is a very powerful way to frame something in this sort of either or way of moving forward.
You want to move?
Even when... what I'd call an interesting...
That's something that I actively pursue, and that's how I feel. I feel privileged, truly.
Tom, thank you.
Peter, thanks, man.
What I'd call an interesting interview.
Thanks, pal. It was terrific, man. Thank you. Thank you.
It was terrific. God,
I thought it was terrific.
even after you told me to learn some manners.
That's all right. You stepped out of line. I whacked you. We got on with it. Good on you.
So I really like this way that Tom handles the situation, because he can be very assertive, but he's got this big smile on his face. And I think this makes him a lot more likable in this situation. It doesn't work for everybody, but I think it's working here because I think you can look and you can see that Tom is very, very comfortable in this role. He's done, he appears to be a very, very confident person. And so I think he can definitely get away with being very polite and also being very confrontational at the same time. It's like the sort of being a strong character, but tempering it by being friendly. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that, there is a middle ground here. So you've seen the very aggressive style. If you've seen the other interview breakdowns of the channel, you've seen the very aggressive style of Quentin Tarantino, very fiery, very calling out energy. And then you also have Robert Downey Jr., who was really passive and really trying to be polite up until the moment where he just kind of had this blowout. He couldn't really control his emotional response. So both Tarantino and Robert Downey Jr. had a lot of trouble controlling their temper, controlling their anger. And with Tom, I think you can see a little bit of that fire showing through, but I think he's able to better control his internal state And he seems to have a more comfortable relationship with conflict here in this interview. And if you can also adopt that sort of comfort about the idea of conflict, you'll find yourself better able to handle situations assertively, but not turning into a blowout, right? So if you're in a professional relationship or a sales situation, sometimes you have to be assertive, but you don't have the luxury of being able to be aggressive and go for somebody's jugular in these cases, and you probably wouldn't want to. I wanted to show you this because there is a middle ground. You can actually be very confident and very assertive and control the frame without having to be a complete jerk, right? Being confident in this. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you got something out of it, please like and subscribe.